Thanks. So what I'm going to be talking about is a connection or sort of overlapping between two major ways of engaging with nature and animals and life, which develop at the same time, often connected but also slightly separate. And the first is obviously the history of the zoo, which, as we've sort of been hearing, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, develops over the course, well, from the 19th century onwards, as a key arena linking the public, linking science, linking art, whole range of different areas in terms of human-animal relations and so on. The other area, which is more where my own research in, is the way in which, over this exact same period, from the late 18th century up until the present, then life and the Earth is given a deep history based around sort of development, based around geological change, and at least in the sort of 19th and early 20th century valences, based around sort of progress moving through different worlds dominated by different types of creatures, but often with a sort of logic of rise and fall, with different animal lineages moving from an age of fish to an age of amphibians, an age of reptiles, an age of mammals, and then within these conceptualizations also thinking about the current period as being the age of man in both this kind of anthropocentric and also highly gendered manner. So what I want to do in this talk is think about how these two areas sometimes fit together. And that was what I was kind of interested in thinking about, putting the kind of abstract together. And going through this, I sort of come to the conclusion that the zoo obviously isn't the prime arena for thinking about deep time and these developmental histories of the Earth. But it does have a sort of subterranean connection that comes out in various interesting ways at different times. I'm going to be talking about a few of those over the course of the next 20 or so minutes. What I am going to do is, you may have noticed in the abstract, it said 1880s to the present as my chronology, but it's going to be more limited than that, both to keep in terms of time, but also for some thematic issues I'm going to be thinking about a bit later. But if you do want to think about, talk about prehistoric elements in the modern zoo, then that's probably a good thing for the Q&A. But as we sort of heard in Max's paper especially, the period from about the 1880s to the 1950s is a really, really important one for zoos as they become tied with various forms of public education, the media, and various other sort of aspects. But it's similarly, if conceptualizations of deep time and prehistory, similarly important. So museums, and naturalist museums in particular, are creating these very lively displays. You're getting prehistory dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals being depicted in the media and in film and so on. So it's one where you do have these parallel developments occurring across both the zoo and across, conceptualizations of deep time. Another reason I didn't want to focus on the contemporary period is because if you do, it's very difficult to get away from these. So these massive, incongruous images, reconstructions of either animatronic or static dinosaurs, which very often feature in modern zoos, and there are, I think, quite interesting things going on here in terms of how this connects with, the public media, the different purposes and the different valences of the zoo. But I want to kind of go a bit deeper and a bit more historical than that. Having said that, though, the history of depicting prehistoric animals in zoos is quite long and quite varied. So this is the first example. If anyone knows anything earlier, I'd be really interested to hear. But the first example I've been able to come across of a prehistoric animal being depicted in a zoo display isn't a dinosaur, and it's not a European or North American example. It's actually set up in Melbourne Zoological Gardens in the 1880s, and it's this kind of big wooden display board depicting a diprotodon, which is a large herbivorous marsupial, which the image of which hadn't really been fixed at this time, which is why if you know a current reconstruction of diprotodon, it doesn't look very much like that. But this is a sort of major centerpiece of the Melbourne Museum, and is widely reported in the press at the time as showing this very local form of prehistory. Interestingly, it's also put in place at exactly the same time, as you can see in the newspaper report, that a sort of reconstructed settlement of Aboriginal Australians is also put in place at the museum. So it's one of these sorts of areas where there could be many things going on here. It could be that once a zoo has a large display of animals, it moves on to displaying both prehistory and humans in this sort of very colonial, very sort of, naturalizing sort of way. Or obviously it could also be drawing more direct conceptual links of linking, the prehistory of life with colonized peoples who are being presented as of being, out of time and subject to various colonial ideologies. So that's one example. The two sort of larger scale ones which come into place are put in place in Germany around just before the First World War, and there's a very good article by Ilya Newland who talks about these. So there's a large prehistoric park of these model dinosaurs which are put in place in Hagenbeck Zoo about 2 years in Stellingen, about 2 years after the zoo itself opens. And you can see them there, and they're quite dramatic, mainly North American dinosaurs. And interestingly, this is also put in place at exactly the same time that the Volkerschau, so the sort of the place where people from Germany's colonies would be also sort of displayed as specimens within the zoo space. So they're kind of also sort of linked together in this quite disturbing linkage of the prehistoric past with the colonized world. There's also at the Berlin Aquarium, which is probably put in place as a sort of way of Berlin maintaining its status as a premier scientific institution in comparison with Hamburg. It builds a new aquarium in 1913. You can see it's got this large, quite folkloric iguanodon guarding the entrance. There's a triceratops skull at the top. There are ammonites along the walkways. And then there's a whole load of murals depicting various prehistoric animals along the side by the artist Heinrich Harder. So again, really stamping this particular part of the zoo where you have the fish, but also the reptiles and the amphibians as being, within prehistory. There are many other examples. In terms of kind of prehistoric parks within zoos, there are more examples of kind of failed ones, and there are actually constructed ones, but here are a couple which are made in the early 20th century. So there's a very big display at Calgary Zoo of various North American dinosaurs in the late 1930s, and I knew there was someone from Artists coming, so I decided to put the two quite charming artist dinosaurs, which you can see from the street in front of the zoo there, which were actually made by one of the zoo's old reptile curators, who was also an amateur artist, and these are sort of constructed as part of his sort of engagement. And the sort of final interesting example of one of these, and the ways in which prehistory gets presented within zoo space, is the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., where the reptile house, which is built in 1931, has this very sort of, this prehistoric portal you have to pass through in order to go from the regular zoo into the age of reptiles or their sort of descendants. And it's, you can see sort of at the top, you've got these pillars with pterosaurs at the front, then a horned toad and a turtle of some kind. Then you've got this mural of a stegosaurus at the top, various sort of, these were the original gates. They were since taken away, but these golden dinosaurs on the gates, and the pillars themselves are actually Jurassic limestone, so they've got various fossils within them. So really sort of dramatically implicating within zoo architecture that the reptile house is where you see the legacies of deep time. So those are sort of some elements. Now we're going to move on to the ZSL, or the London Zoo elements. And there aren't very well, there are some within the modern zoo, but the kind of way in which deep time and evolutionary history tends to focus around sort of London Zoo is particularly in the first half of the 20th century, is using particular modern zoo animals as, or presenting them as being, lessons in prehistory or evolution. And it's really interesting in terms of which animals get selected. Obviously, and we know this from work by Jack Ashley and others, monotremes, for example, are very often described as being sort of evolutionary relics or throwbacks. So Julian Huxley describes the echidna that you could apparently see in London Zoo in the late 1930s as a relic of the earliest type of mammal, which when it had only half evolved from its reptilian ancestry. Here you've also got the kiwi and the tuatara, so two other amphibian animals being presented in the press in this similar sort of way. Huxley is presenting the armadillo as a kind of inferior type which was able to evolve in South America because it was isolated. The rhino, particularly in the 1890s and 1900s, is also very often depicted as a prehistoric creature, so a relic of the antediluvian world, in ways that connect with views of evolution and sort of and kind of evolutionary energies in a very sort of Fondacet type way. Also in the top left, you can see these tarsiers, which came to ZSL in the 1940s as a link with the human family. And this, I think, is referring to quite an idiosyncratic idea in human evolutionary studies in the early 20th century, which is that humans didn't evolve from a lineage which included the other great apes. They actually evolved directly from tarsoid ancestors, and so have a kind of special directed lineage. And so the kind of reporting there is sort of moving into this. So within the kind of way in which the zoo kind of management and communicators work with the press to generate interest in news or arrivals, then the kind of links with prehistory are really kind of important and really pervasive. There are two examples which are particularly interesting in terms of communicating different scientific messages. So the first is the tapir, and tapirs really from the turn of the 19th century are very often presented as creatures which are very similar to the first mammals which kind of went to rule the earth in the aftermath of the disappearance of the dinosaurs. So this is presented by people like Cuvier in the 1790s and 1800s, for example. So again, the tapir is being kind of depicted as an antediluvian animal again. But they're also used to provide lessons in evolution and biogeography and so on. So on the left, from the Guide to London Zoo from 1936, this is explaining that you find tapirs today in South and Central America and in Southeast Asia, which means, according to the explanation, that in the deep past, and fossils could be used to demonstrate this, they inhabited a much wider area that has since been driven out and only survived in regions which were regarded as, peripheral or primitive, and so on. And so this becomes a way of saying that in order to understand, animal biogeography, then it's essential to bring in paleontology and deep time studies. Another issue where tapirs become quite significant is in ideas of kind of either phylogenetic memory or in terms of sort of recapitulation theory, where there's a kind of very widespread notion in late 19th and early 20th century biology that animals develop from the embryo up until adulthood by passing through all different stages of their former evolutionary history. And so within this, the fact that the baby tapir is spotted and striped indicates not that these are kind of small young animals that need to sort of hide and camouflage themselves, but this indicates that their ancestors back in the Eocene were also spotted and striped, and so it becomes a way of imagining their deep history. So yeah, the baby Malayan tapir is in the garb of his remoter ancestors. To link back with Wessel's paper, then hippos also, particularly in the UK, are also connected with deep time and evolution and so on, and represented in this way. So this comes from, changes in paleontology during this period, but also from the vast amount of digging which occurs in London and southern England during the 19th century. And when this digging happens for construction works and so on, then quite often the bones of Pleistocene animals would come up. So elephant, rhino, hyena, lion, and also hippo. And this, in a parallel way with the kind of Victorian hippomania, leads to a huge amount of reflection on the way in which the deep past of the city, the land that became the city, has shifted, and how it can be imagined as another transition of eras. So this is the frontispiece to Huxley's At the Zoo, and he sort of writes, "Few will regret the passing of the hippopotamus from Britain's shores." This other article from The Sphere, another kind of illustrated journal, captions this image of a London Zoo hippo with his ancestors wallowed in the Thames, but also reflects on modern threats to these animals in ways which to us might seem quite disturbing. Like the author writes, "It's not likely that man was in any measure instrumental in exterminating the hippopotamus in Europe, but civilized man will be the Asian before whose advance this animal will disappear in Africa." So this being another kind of inevitable transfer of the eras as, civilization conquers the world from the last relics of the age of mammals. Obviously, though, the kind of reptiles and connections with dinosaurs are very, 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 very prominent in illustrated media in this period, and this is a time when dinosaurs are becoming really, really sort of dominant in public views of prehistory and deep time. So there are many examples I could have used, but this is from the Illustrated London News, and it shows, a Jackson's chameleon, which had just been taken to London Zoo in the 1930s, and the kind of reporting to generate interest in this animal is showing that it recalls the dinosaur Triceratops, a giant armored lizard of millions of years ago. So showing that there are these links across the eras, and there are quite interesting things going sort of going on here. So firstly, this could be a way of, generating interest for, the cold-blooded, ectothermic, uncharismatic animals that Wessel was sort of talking about. But on the other hand, this is also reflecting ideas of, change in the eras. So back in sort of deep primeval times, the reptiles were these huge, gigantic, dramatic creatures, but now they only persist in this kind of current world as, shadows and evocations. And as with the hippo, this is often presented as a good thing. So the American artist Charles R. Knight, who's incidentally the person who designed the Stegosaurus for the Smithsonian Reptile House, wrote that, fortunately for our peace of mind, these sinister beings, the dinosaurs, departed this earth ages before man made his initial appearance. The most sort of dramatic, or the largest upsurge in dinosaurian sort of analogies in the press during the interwar period is when the first Komodo dragons are sort of displayed in zoos in North America and Europe. And I'm wondering if Russell actually wrote about this or has looked at this in any... Yeah, because... Yes. So it's a really interesting but quite complicated story where they're taken obviously from, well, mainly Flores, but also Komodo in 1926, 1927. Firstly by an American expedition which has taken them back to Bronx Zoo, where the two surviving ones die very quickly afterwards. But there's then another expedition which kind of collects about 10 of them on demand for different zoos all around Europe. So they go to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, one goes to Berlin, but also two come to London. And in the reporting, these are presented as being, lineal descendants of the stupendous dinosaurs of the Jurassic period, a giant lizard transplanted from the volcanic island of Komodo. So again, sort of feeding into these ideas that these sort of lost relics of the deep past still persist in areas around the world which are regarded as being peripheral to Europeans. There is a bit of a distinct way, though, in which the sort of two London Zoo Komodo dragons are depicted, which maybe confounds this slightly, in that they actually become really sort of widely depicted media celebrities. So they're called Sumba and Sumbawa, and they're kind of gendered as male and female. It turns out they're actually both male when they die. So they're photographed by the Royal Photographic Society as sort of, but also they become these major celebrities. And Joan Proctor, who is the curator of reptiles and amphibians, she writes a very, very large number of articles on how peaceful, how tractable, how gentle they are, how intelligent they are. She writes, and this is the photograph is actually from her scientific paper in the Proceedings of ZSL, with this quite ill-advised picture of a child with a Komodo dragon. But she writes, while they tear to pieces wild pigs, they can be trusted with small children. So it's sort of, which it's really, and so it's, on the one hand, I think this is making an argument that in London we can treat these animals better than in New York where they will die. But also I think this is Proctor, I think maybe confounding some of the 19th century stereotypes that Helen was talking about when she was talking about the snakes. These aren't, primitive, unintelligent creatures which don't do anything. These are actually, they have their own distinct way of being, but, they're social, they're intelligent, and they can be engaged with in these different interesting ways. And they do become, scientific celebrities. Proctor actually describes them as being as famous as Douglas Fairbanks in the early 1930s. So, anyway, so it's the final thing is just going to kind of move on to sort of issues around landscape. And this, I think, leads to a kind of larger sort of set of questions and reflections. And it's the fact that when Whipsnade is set up near Dunstable in southern England, then one of the things which is done while the zoo is being built is carving out this gigantic chalk lion into the hills. And it's huge. It's still there. It's 150 meters long and so on. And it's presented in much of the press in terms of, modernity. So the idea is that this is preventing sort of pilots from coming too close to the zoo and scaring the animals, then occasionally being presented in terms of advertising and so on. But the kind of practice and the sort of semantics around, chalk figures in English culture is very sort of distinct. And I think it is very much sort of resonating and drawing on that in connecting with, things like the Uffington White Horse, the Long Man of Wilmington and so on, which by the sort of 1920s, 1930s, there is still argument about, whether these are actually prehistoric things or whether they're sort of early modern and so on. But nevertheless, this sort of image and this sort of thing etched in the landscape is putting the modern zoo within this deeper trajectory going back into the deep past. And this is also kind of reflected on more directly in the press. So this is a really interesting a newspaper article from a newspaper called The Citizen, but it reflects on, you know, the chalk figure which is being built on Whipsnade, and directly sort of making links with that and the older chalk figures. But it also thinks about and reflects on how around Whipsnade itself there are many, many, many finds of stone artifacts from the Paleolithic and so on. And so this becomes another sort of mode in which the landscape is made in terms of kind of deep connections with the modern period, but also an ancient time when all England was a zoo because it was still inhabited by lions, hippos, rhino, and so on. So really, really interesting in terms of, you know, the cultural politics of the 1930s, and, you know, and in ways that kind of continue until today. So I think I'll leave things there, so thanks.